God's word. Leviticus chapter 12, I'm right in the right spot, or not chapter 12, chapter 11, verses 13 through 23. These, moreover, you shall detest among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are detestable. The eagle, and the vulture, and the buzzard, and the kite, and the falcon in its kind, every raven in its kind, and the ostrich, and the owl, and the gull, and the hawk in its kind, and the little owl, and the cormorant, and the great owl, and the white owl, and the pelican, and the carrion vulture, and the stork, the heron and its kinds, and the hoopoe, and the bat. All the swarming things that fly and that walk on all fours are detestable to you. Yet these you may eat among all the swarming things that fly and that walk on all fours, those which have above their feet jointed legs with which to jump on the earth. These of them you may eat, the locust and its kinds, and the devastating locust and its kinds, and the cricket and its kinds, and the grasshopper and its kinds. But all other swarming things that fly and that are four-footed are detestable to you. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. All right. Well, as I preview to some of you throughout the week, this isn't an easy text to exegete. We've got in the previous chapter, I don't know if my two beloved brothers here did the homework or not. You did? Okay, very good. So then you'll remember that in the previous bit of this chapter, we got a whole bunch of reasons why we can eat this food or that food, right? We were told they got to have split hooves. We were told they got to have, they got to chew cud. For the fish, they got to have scales. They got to have fins. For the birds, we aren't given any reason. So it's a little bit harder. We have to try a little harder. Logan, you're welcome to use the binder. So we have a bunch of winged animals, and we have to go through the discerning process of figuring out why they're bad. They're not arbitrary, right? Nothing God gives here is arbitrary. We also mentioned last time that there are unsatisfactory answers, such as, well, these particular birds are, they eat particular things. While I think that is part of it with some of these birds, it's not true for all of these birds. For example, carrion birds, that is probably the reason why, because they eat death. We'll get there. But it's not true of the fish birds, the birds that go about in the ocean. They're not carrion birds. So this is not a satisfactory answer for all of them. We mentioned with the fish last time how in Jewish culture outside of the Bible, so more Talmudic, they said, oh, it's real easy to determine what's a clean or unclean animal. Is it vegetarian? Well, that's not helpful, actually. Because one, there's a bunch of unclean animals that are vegetarian because their hooves don't split. But two, the fish are carnivorous. So this isn't the answer. So we're going to have to take our time and really examine what these different birds are and why they are unclean. Because they are to teach the children of Israel. We mentioned this last time. Deuteronomy 14 is very much clearly a dietary, don't eat this. Leviticus 11 is not that. We haven't gotten to it yet, but Leviticus 11 is far more than just eating. It's touching and other items related to these unclean animals. There's something more here than just dietary, because on the face of it, you read some of these food items, and it's not as if the Israelites were necessarily tempted to eat some of these things, just as we aren't necessarily tempted to eat some of these, food items that come up. So let's take them in our stride. So first, I have our first category, what I would call wilderness birds, birds that appear in the wilderness and make their home in the wilderness. So that would include here our owls, all three mentioned, little, great, white. Ostrich also is a wilderness bird. It lives way outside the bounds of, you're not going into a city. You see doves and pigeons and whatnot, and then an ostrich, that's not going to happen. Ostriches don't tend to hang out unless it escaped the zoo or something. Hawks as well are wilderness birds. And so this is to teach the people not to be a people of the wilderness, but to be a people of the world. This is hugely important because Israel is oftentimes failing in this mission of theirs. Israel is called, we have not received that yet in our text up to this point, but it is presumed up to this point. We'll see it explicitly mentioned in Deuteronomy. But Israel is to be a light to the nations. It's to be a light to the nations, and it is constantly supposed to be evangelizing to them. And they're terrible at this job in more than one way. Normally, they're terrible at this job because they take on the idolatry of the world rather than bringing Yahweh to the world. But in other times, they don't want to bring it to the world, as in the case in particular of Jonah. Jonah, where does he try to go? He tries to go off to the wilderness. He tries to escape to the wilderness rather than go to the city, which we are to be people of the city, so to speak, because we are people of the city, the holy city of God. The pattern of history is going in this direction. It's from garden to city, back to garden, right? And we have come to the point of city. In the Old Testament, you have basically epistles in the same way that the New Testament has epistles. But in the Old Testament, it's to nations. In the New Testament, it's to cities, particular. God is very concerned with the cities. Now, I want to take some time on that issue because this has been a bit of controversy in recent times due to such influencers as Timothy Keller and Gospel Coalition, right? The broader thing. Now, move aside all the issues, all right, that theologically and all the rest of it. I'm just talking about this one little area, okay? That includes with Gospel Coalition, as much as there are issues with them. Right. They really had this emphasis about bringing the gospel to the city and what that meant. And there was a bit of pushback, and there continues to be a bit of pushback, in which there are some Christians that say, well, you are wrongly going for the city when we've got all these suburbs and rural places that need to be targeted because, for one, there's more people. Technically, right? If you gather them all together, though they're dispersed more, there's more of them. And while I agree with this, and while I think that Keller and the Gospel Coalition kind of went to a level where it did seem like it was, these guys we don't need to worry about, they'll figure themselves out. They were ultimately right in that biblically, we are supposed to be targeting cities and taking them over. That's where Christians are supposed to find their centrality of their powerful movement wherever they're located, is in cities, to take over the cities, and then you take over the countryside, right? That's the picture. This is what happens in Joshua. And throughout the conquering of Canaan, they're going city to city and then conquering the land around it. That's how we should look at our conquering. Again, this is not to put down or to say that we don't, in the meantime, put churches in rural places or suburban areas. They need churches, and we need to be everywhere. But we also need to have a particular mind to target cities. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 13 reads, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. I did not at all mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the greedy and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with any so-called brother, if he is a sexually immoral person, or greedy, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Are you not to judge those who are within the church? But those who are outside, God will judge. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves. And Paul is saying here, we are not to remove ourselves from the world. Pastor Hotchkiss mentioned this this morning in his sermon about the Pharisees. And while they are in a sense, the target focus oftentimes of the gospel as the bad guys, the reason why they're even mentioned is because there's a greater condemnation on all those who aren't mentioned. Right? The Essenes are not mentioned at all. Right? And that's a condemnation in and of itself. Right? The Sadducees are mentioned very little. And that in itself is also a condemnation. Christ is going to the Pharisees because these are the people that have, in a sense, the best chance, if you will, if we're talking outside of Calvinistic, terminology, the best chance to believe because they were the closest to the truth. The Sadducees were the liberals who just, there's no help in them, right? You could speak the truth to them, but as Christ says, don't cast pearl before swine. That's the Sadducees, right? But the Pharisees, a great number of them, are saved. So much so that at the Council of Jerusalem, there's apparently an entire party of Pharisees that are Christians. The Judaizers come in as Pharisees, which means to some degree they had to have put a belief in Christ, even if they were in part rejecting the gospel based upon their Judaizing beliefs. But nevertheless, they came closer, in a sense, than their unbelieving Pharisees who denied Jesus altogether. And so we are not to be people of the wilderness. We are not to be Anabaptists, all right, who go out, separate ourselves from the world, go live off solitarily. This is normally what we see with birds like ostriches and owls. They live very solitary lives. Same with hawks. We are to be people in the world because, one, we are conquering the world, and this much is true, but we also, it belongs to us. We live here. This is ours. So that would be our first point, is wilderness birds, don't be people in the world. I kind of sidetracked myself, so I'll make the point that I got off of. But with Jonah, where he was trying to escape to the wilderness, his issue was not wanting to evangelize Nineveh because he knew that if Nineveh is getting the gospel, Israel, northern kingdom at this point, Israel has been rejected in a sense. And so it is being moved out, and that's why Jonah's throwing a pity party at the end of the book of Jonah, because he's upset knowing that God has rejected. I don't so much take the racial lens on it, because I believe that Jonah was a true prophet of God, and so he would have understood these things better than most people. But I do think that that's his hang-up, is that he knows what all of this means, and this much is true. Remember that the minor prophets are one book originally, and so Jonah's in a line of Micah, Nahum, so it's really one story there. You don't want to disconnect the three stories from each other. All right, next part, we've got seabirds, gulls, storks, pelicans, herons, ospreys. I put osprey in here. I forget which word I changed it out for in the LSB, so I apologize, but I think osprey is the better translation. It's because it's a seabird. And so we are to be people of the land as opposed to people of the sea. Now, there's a lot there as it relates to the sea, right? We mentioned this last time with the fish. The sea is the abyss, and it's not just the Gentile world. It includes the chaos of the Gentile world, but the reason why the Gentile world is chaotic is because of demons, okay? So this is what it's making reference to. We'll get down to that later about the connection between bad birds and demons, but just assume I'm right at this point. We are to be people of the land instead, people of the land. This is not to say that you can't go on a boat and fish and enjoy. We're talking about symbolics here, okay? Symbolically, we are people of the land. And we are people of the land in the sense that we are spreading the land to cover the whole of the earth. In Daniel chapter 2, when we see the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, when the rock comes and hits the imperial statue, we read this in verses 31 through 35. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great image. That image, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was rising up in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that image was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands. It is without human power. And it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. And the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This imagery is picked up at the end of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. Right? The chaos of the demons and the sea is being swallowed up by the ever-expanding mountain, which is Christ's kingdom, over the earth. Right? The picture there in Daniel that is oftentimes missed, including by beloved pastors at Presbyterian churches, is that the emperors down the line, Christ is the last and perfect one. Right? He is the new. He is the final Messiah. As Cyrus is called Messiah, it is related to his office as emperor. So Nebuchadnezzar is the first anointed of this new class after the kings are removed. And remember, when the restoration happens, when they come back, they're not supposed to put a king, right? The so to speak, the descendant, officially wise, the descendant of Zerubbabel would be Pilate, right? The governor. And that's now who's supposed to be in charge of Judea until Christ, Messiah, the final one, comes. Nero is the last of the only human emperors, and then Christ, the God-man, is now the ever-continuing God-man Messiah emperor who rules and reigns over the earth. All right, I have some idol birds, and these, with the exception of eagles, I really didn't know what else to do with them other than to read commentaries and see what they had to say. And I'll tell you what, the studying for this passage was rough. The commentary notes are very sparse. They said, yeah, bats, you can't eat them. Oh, and they're counted as birds because they're winged animals. Oh, thank you. Very helpful. All right, so I'm going with idle birds. I'm putting bats, eagles, and hoopoes in this. Now, eagles can fit in a couple of categories here, but each of these birds, as I was doing research, all of them had some sort of relation to idolatry. Eagles in particular, Zeus, eagles. You could throw ravens in there because of Odin and some other pagans, but ravens have a really unique role in the Bible, so we're going to leave them last. And then their diets are interesting. The one that I had this, absolute struggle, here I am laying it all bare and being transparent. I didn't know what to do with the hoopoes, okay? They do have a history of being birds of idolatry, but that's the most I got for you. They're pretty neat looking birds. They got this like crown on them. They're loud and annoying. That was what one of the commentators said. They were noisy, and so that's why they're an unclean bird. I don't see any reason. I feel like there's a good number of pigeons that are really annoying too. So I don't know if hoopoes are, worse. Well, cranes did make it onto the list. So, so that's what I've got for idle birds. Teaching them, don't worship the birds, just as we had in the previous chapter, animals as idols. The first idolatry is to an animal, Satan. All right. Now I have a few items as it relates to a collection of these birds in how they are unclean. Swooping birds, which a good number of these are, hawks, eagles, and ospreys, and the like. Swooping has a negative connotation most of the time in the scripture, and normally as a judgment from God. Hosea chapter 8. If you need help finding that, it's the book right after Daniel, first minor prophet.
If I may add about the hoopoe.
Yes.
The simple Google search, it just might be totally off. Correct me if it's wrong. says the reason that they're unclean is because of they eat snails, spiders, centipedes, antlions, lizards, which like other things that are considered unclean.
Which could be the case, but there's a good number of clean birds that eat insects and things, that's most commentaries is that it's what the things eat themselves, but I remain unconvinced of this because of the fact that the clean animals most of the time have similar dietary items. Chapter 8, verse 1 of Hosea reads, "Put the trumpet to your mouth. Like an eagle, the enemy comes against the house of Yahweh because they have trespassed against my covenant and transgressed against my law." This is speaking of Assyria's destruction of Israel. And then if you flip over just a couple books to Habakkuk, just right after Nahum, chapter 1, I think? Yes, chapter 1, verses 7 through 9. Now this is of the Chaldeans. "They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and exaltation come forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and sharper than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping down to devour." Another example that just came to my head is Obadiah. This also appears in Jeremiah as well, this part of the prophecy. "The arrogance of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the cliff, in the height of your habitation, who says in his heart, 'Who will bring me down to earth?' Though you build loftily like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares Yahweh." So this swooping nature seems to have some connection to pride and self-exaltation, as we saw in Habakkuk, that the Chaldeans, their justice comes from out of themselves, their own pride. Obadiah speaks of the eagle putting his nest in the stars as an issue of loftiness. And then Hosea, we know of the Assyrians from Isaiah chapter 10, that they act out of the pride of their heart. So swooping is another aspect of which we are not supposed to engage in. I'm going to circle back on this item here, but the idea is we don't conquer, and we don't act as Christians. We don't take over, and conquer is a perfectly good word. I'll stick with that. We don't conquer in the same way as the pagans do, as the swooping eagles. All right. There's a connection with these birds that's similar to the item of wilderness, to that of desolation. Isaiah chapter 34 doesn't just give us birds, but a couple of animals of desolation. I'm going to start all the way back in verse 8. It says, "For Yahweh has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion, and its streams will be turned into pitch, and its dust into brimstone, and its land will become burning pitch. It will not be quenched night or day. Its smoke will go up forever. From generation to generation, it will be laid waste. None will pass through it forever and ever. But pelican and hedgehog will possess it, and owl and raven will dwell in it, and he will stretch over it the line of utter formlessness." That's the same word there as is used at the beginning of Genesis, of the formlessness of the earth. "And the plumb line of utter void." That is also the same word, formless and void. Its nobles, there is no one there whom they may proclaim king, and all its princes will be non-existent. And thorns will come up in its fortified towers, weeds and thistles in its fortified cities. It will also be a haunt of jackals, or dragons, better translation, dragons, and an abode of ostriches. And the desert creatures will meet with the wolves. The hairy goat also will cry to its kind. Surely the night creature will obtain relief there, and will find itself a resting place. The owl will make its nest and find its escape there, and it will hatch its eggs and gather them in its shade. Surely the falcons will be gathered there, every one with its kind. Seek from the book of Yahweh and read. Not one of these will be missing. None will lack its mate, for his mouth has commanded and the Spirit has gathered them. He has cast the lot for them, and his hand has divided it to them by line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation, they will dwell in it. So these unclean birds are, in a sense, harbingers or signs of desolation, that is the curse of God. And all of this is really coming to a head here. But we are contrasted in desolation. We take those places of desolation from those unclean birds. Right? We are not the unclean birds who are living there, but we are the ones who replace the unclean birds. Later in Isaiah, we read of this. Chapter 54, verses 1 through 3. Shout for joy, O barren woman who has not given birth. Break forth into joyful shouting and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor. For more numerous are the sons of the desolate one than the sons of the married woman, says Yahweh. Enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch out the curtains of your dwellings. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your pegs. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your seed will possess nations and will resettle the desolate cities. And again, chapter 62, verses 1 through 5. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not keep quiet, until her righteousness goes forth like brightness, and her salvation like a torch that is burning. The nations will see your righteousness, and all kings your glory, and you will be called by a new name, which the mouth of Yahweh will designate. You will also be a crown of glory in the hand of Yahweh, and a turban of royalty in the hand of your God. It will no longer be said to you, forsaken, nor to your land will it any longer be said, desolate. But you will be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. For Yahweh takes pleasure in you, and to him your land will be married. For as a young man marries a virgin, so your sons will marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so your God will rejoice over you. There's nuptial themes that are related with clean birds, but we don't have that here, so I'm not going to go into that too much. If we want to go into that, we can preach through the Gospel of John. All right. As it relates to demons, unclean birds and demons, Zechariah chapter 5 is a passage that people struggle with, don't know what to do, and prefer to just ignore it most of the time. Or you end up with a Joel Webben kind of thing where you end up saying, well, this is here. See, you got woman demons, kind of deal. That's not what's going on. We're going to read the whole chapter because it's a very short chapter, and I think you need the whole context. I don't just want to read about the storks and then go, there you go, demons. Okay, so let's go through the whole thing. Then I lifted up my eyes, and if you need help finding Zechariah, it's right before Malachi. Go Matthew, Malachi. Then I lifted up my eyes again and saw, and behold, a flying scroll. And he said to me, what do you see? And I said, I see a flying scroll. Its length is 20 cubits, and its width 10 cubits. Then he said to me, this is the curse that is going forth over the face of the whole land. Surely everyone who steals will be purged away according to the writing on one side, and everyone who swears will be purged away according to the writing on the other side. I will make it go forth, declares Yahweh, Sabaoth, and it will enter the house of the thief and the house of the one who swears falsely by my name, and it will spend the night within that house and consume it with its timber and stones. Then the angel who was speaking with me went out and said to me, lift up now your eyes and see what this is going forth. So I said, what is it? And he said, this is the ephah going forth. Again he said, this is their appearance in all the land. And behold, a lead cover was lifted up, and this is a woman sitting inside the ephah. Then he said, this is wickedness. And he threw her down into the middle of the ephah and threw the lead weight on its opening. And I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, two women were coming out with the wind in their wings, and they had wings like the wings of a stork. And they lifted up the ephah between the earth and the heavens. And I said to the angel who was speaking with me, where are they taking the ephah? Then he said to me, to build a house for her in the land of Shinar, and when its prepared. She will be set there on her own pedestal. One of the things I love about the book of Zechariah is how much I identify with Zechariah. What is going on? What does this mean? What's happening here? As the angels continually explain to him what's happening. Now, my intent is not to go ahead and exegete this passage, which is a very difficult passage, but either take my word for it or talk to me after this sermon. But what's going on here is a description of the false temple that is going to be around in the day of Jesus. It is the thieves' house, the robber's den, right? And the demons behind it are the cap on top of it. And as you see in Revelation, that God lifts up that cap so that the demons pour out upon Jerusalem, as Jesus even says, that as he casts out these demons, he says what's going to happen. The demon's going to go back, bring 7 more with him, and, make the place worse. And that's what happened in Jerusalem in the last days. I think I don't remember who I was talking with about, I think it was Wednesday night, where I was talking about what the Jews were doing, where they would dress up as women and then seduce men, do a terrible deed in bed, and then kill them. And then I think it was Jacob who asked, why didn't they just kill him? Why did they do that part? And I said, they're demon-possessed. And then Jim kept talking, so there was no explanation beyond that point. But yeah, they're demon-possessed. That's what happened. They were completely filled with demons, and so they acted in absolutely immoral and insane ways. And we see this, again, this issue of unclean birds as it relates to demons in Revelation, as it happens, in chapter 18 and verse 2. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, and she has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean bird, and a prison of every unclean and hateful beast. All right? So Babylon here is Jerusalem. It's the only one that I think makes sense. I know that there are folks who say Babylon here is referring to Rome, but I don't think that's the case. It's the woman who has Babylon written on her head, and she's riding the dragon, who would be Rome. So Babylon, I think, is more fitting. Also, I think that Peter was in Jerusalem when he said, I'm writing to you from Babylon. So it is a place filled with demons. Now, as it relates to the dead, we're bringing some issues back here. They're not all disconnected. Matthew's gospel, Luke's also mentioned it, but I went with Matthew's because I'm more aware of it. In Matthew 24, verse 28, it says, wherever the corpse is, there the eagles will gather. And your translations will probably say vultures, but eagles is probably a better translation. And most Bibles will put a little note that says, or eagles. I think eagles is the better rendering. We render it, almost all the translations render it eagles in Revelation, but almost all of them, it's the same word. So that's my 2 cents. But it refers to their gathering around the dead, their consuming of the dead. All right, now this is where it gets complicated, if it wasn't already complicated enough. The one bird, the one unclean bird that's the most complicated in this list are ravens. Because ravens, despite being unclean birds, do a lot of good things and help out a lot. So first, let's look at how I'll say this. Ravens probably also, one of the reasons why they are used in the way that they're used is by their name. Their name is Oreb in the Hebrew, and the word evening is Ereb, and so there's probably a wordplay there at use. That seems to be the case in several places, including in Genesis with the flood and Noah, that evening is related to the raven, which in a sense makes sense. Evening is dark, ravens are black, that sort of deal. But they also relate to Gentiles. They relate to work, and not bad work either, good work. Ravens, as unclean birds, actually have a role in the gospel itself, which again is somewhat confusing. But when we think about several items of God's redemptive history, especially if we start in Genesis 1, God's redemptive work always starts with darkness and goes to light. There is evening and then morning one day. And so these ravens bring forth the call of judgment, but we'll get there. I've jumped myself. First, they are an item of cursedness. All right. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 26 says, "And your carcasses will be food to all birds of the sky and to the beasts of the earth, and there will be no one to frighten them away." Now, here in Deuteronomy, it mentions all birds, but as we see it played out in Scripture, both before this point and after, it's always ravens that tend to appear. With Abram, as he's protecting his sacrifice for the evening, ravens come, and he has to, shoo them off. Saul's concubine is credited for the fact that she protects both Jonathan and Saul's bodies from the ravens. And this is credited to her as keeping them from being cursed. Right? So there's an item of cursedness as it relates to birds and the hanging on a tree. So Christ takes upon that curse, though we are not given any mention of birds eating him. He fulfills it through hanging on the tree because the two are related to each other. You can see that in Genesis with Joseph and the baker. When the baker has explained or tells what his dream is, remember he's hung on a tree. He's also got ravens involved with it. All right, now to the relation of judgment. If we go to Genesis 8, our translations can throw us off. I'm not saying they're bad translations, but I think they can throw us off as to what is actually being said. Genesis 8, verses 6 and 7 say, "Then it happened at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sent out a raven, and it went out flying back and forth until the water was dried up from the earth." Now, that's a pretty good rendition. The ESV and a few other ones are a little more ambiguous with the to and fro business. It kind of sounds in some of these translations, and you could even take it from this if you're reading quickly, that the raven kind of just goes out and does his own thing. But what is being got at here with the back and forth is that he is actually going out and then back to the ark. That's what's happening here, that the raven is maneuvering back and forth between the judged world and the ark. And so the raven is going out in this work as a sign of the gospel, because the raven is going over in connection with that motif and theme of cursedness. It is declaring the curse upon those who had been judged. All right. The bodies are all destroyed by the flood, so there's nothing for this raven to eat. So because their bodies are all bloated and whatever else happens in a flood, right? So the raven isn't enacting its curse through the eating, it's enacting the curse through flying over and coming back. Then the dove is sent out, which is the other angle of the gospel. You can't disassociate the two. Now, what's interesting about Jesus coming is there is a reversal. The mercy and grace come first with Christ instead of judgment. Then comes the judgment. Remember, so we can understand why John the Baptist had some confusion, right, about which came first. He's talking about the day of vengeance as if it's right on the door, and then he hears that Jesus is going around healing people and, generally being a great guy. He's going, well, wait a minute, Jesus, I thought you're supposed to be destroying everything. What's going on here? And he says, he tells him, now, John, remember, Isaiah told you this. First comes the freeing of the captives, then the day of vengeance. That's Isaiah 61. They also are related to provision. Job makes a remark of this, I think, in chapter 38, but I don't have the address on me, so you can find that for yourselves. But there's a play on this that happens later in Luke's gospel off of what is said in Job. But in 1 Kings 17, 1 through 7, we read this. Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, as Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. So now ravens are going to be associated with not only flood, but drought. So both extremes ravens are associated with. Then the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, Go away from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. And it will be that you will drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to sustain you there. Verse 6 says, And the ravens were bringing him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the brook. This is another reason why I somewhat consider it difficult that it is the diet practice of the birds that make them unclean, because here Elijah is taking from the diet practices of the ravens. Luke chapter 12, we have a different version of what we find in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, where God is concerned with the sparrows, right? But in Luke's gospel, what does he speak of? He doesn't speak of sparrows or pigeons or anything like that. He speaks of, I went to Luke 7 rather than 12. He speaks of ravens. Luke chapter 12, verse 24. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap. They have no storeroom nor barn, and yet God feeds them. How much more valuable you are than the birds. And then this idea is picked up in Revelation chapter 12, where the Gentiles are going to be the ones who take care of the church in the wilderness period. Verse 6 of chapter 12, Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished or taken care of for 3.5 years. It says 1,260 days. Remember, this is the same amount of time that Elijah is taken care of by God in the wilderness. So they're all connected there. All right, I'm at 41 minutes, and I still haven't gotten to the critters. So I'm going to have to leave the birds, as much as it's been fun to talk about the birds. But I want to leave off at least on this point as it relates to the ravens. See how God uses the unclean to his ends. All right? He is using, and we've mentioned this before, that uncleanness refers to death. God uses death to his ends, to glory. And so in some ways we are to detest death. That is, we're to detest the sting of death, that is sin, or at least the result of sin. But we are not to hate death entirely, because God uses it to bring us to glory. All right, verses 20 through 23. All the swarming things that fly and that walk on all fours are detestable to you, yet these you may eat among all the swarming things that fly and that walk on all fours. Those which have above their feet jointed legs with which to jump on the earth, these of them you may eat, the locust and its kind, and the devastating locust and its kinds, and the cricket and its kinds, and the grasshopper and its kinds. But all other swarming things that fly and that are four-footed are detestable to you. Well, this part's interesting because, one, we do get some information as to why they're clean, and two, opposed to the previous bit with the birds, where we're just only told what the unclean birds are, here we are told what the clean bugs are, the clean insects, or the clean critters, you might say, because this would include lizards and whatnot who are unclean. Unclean bugs and critters are those that crawl, are the swarming ones. They're the closest to the serpents. They crawl on their belly, as the serpent is cursed to do, and so they are unclean. Worms are your closest item to unclean critter that appears consistently throughout the Bible. Otherwise, there's very little about swarming animals in the scripture to go off of, but Isaiah chapter 14, verses 10 through 12, we read, They will answer and say to you, even you have been made weak as we. You have become like us. Your pride and the music of your harps have been brought down to Sheol. Maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth. You who have weakened the nations. These are the nations responding to Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon, however you want to date that, and that they will be, that Babylon will be brought down. But I want to focus more, as the scripture does here, on the positive side, the jumping locusts. The locusts are consistently used by God for holy judgment, to remove an unclean people, or to at least judge an unclean people. Joel chapter 2, verse 25 says, then I will pay, the whole book is about locusts, so I just picked one verse out of it. Then I will pay back to you in full for the years that the swarming locust has consumed, the creeping locust, the stripping locust, and the gnawing locust, my great military force, which I sent among you. So this is what we are supposed to be, in a sense. We aren't just those who discern. We aren't just those who meditate upon God's word. We aren't just those who protect ourselves in the midst of demons and the unclean. And we aren't those who are just directed by the scriptures. All those are necessary and came first. But now we have this. We are a military force. Recall again that the word priest does not mean a Roman Catholic who has an affinity for little boys. That's not what it means. All right? Priest means keeper or guardian. All right? It's the one who protects. It's a soldier. All right? So remove any other idea of priest out of your mind. He's a soldier. And this is what we are called to. We are the locusts, so to speak, of Christ. We are the soldiers of Christ. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 read, suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. The one enlisted there is not referring to Christ, okay? Where it might be confused. You go, well, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to please Christ? Well, Christ is not the one that he's referring to. The one who enlists would be the one who God used to bring you. So it'd be the human force that brought you to Christ. So that is to say that, someone who got saved under the ministry of John MacArthur is not to make his life about pleasing John MacArthur, right? So then what is being said here about entangling himself in affairs of everyday life can be a little lost. And some commentaries go a little extreme on this point. Right? It's like, yeah, you can't do anything that isn't serving God 24/7. And then they define that in a particular way. Because I would agree with that point, but it has to be defined a particular way. All right? What is being got at here by Paul is that you don't stop being a Christian. Right? In the service of Christ, as a soldier of Christ, as a conquering member of his army, you don't stop being a Christian at any point. You don't go home and put on the secular hat. I'm now secular husband, secular son, secular brother, so on and so forth, right? No, you're still Christian. And you act in all these duties. Now, there's a plainness to this, right? This is where some of the commentaries go out of hand, and they want everyone to be a pastor. Not everyone's supposed to be a pastor. There's a plainness to the Christian life in which God just calls us to good works within our, station in life. And this is being a good soldier. This is how we conquer. For example, women are not called to be pastors. We all know that and agree on this point. So what are they doing? How are they supposed to be good Christian soldiers? What is consistent throughout time and history, we see from scriptural history to church history, that it is strong, faithful women who pray, who move mountains, far more often than it seems recorded that men pray. Oftentimes it's the women who pray, and then the men go and move the mountain. But those men aren't moving any mountain without the prayers of those kindly, obscure, oftentimes, many times, nameless women. And yet that warfare is all the important. Just as when Moses and Israel come up against the Amalekites, or rather they come up against them, Moses must stand up and intercede as Joshua moves and attacks and fights against the Amalekites. Both are necessary and both are warfare. Moses is engaged in warfare as he intercedes on their behalf. And our warfare is a cosmic one, not a carnal one. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. Read, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful, for the tearing down of strongholds, as we tear down speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ." I'm going to finish the sentence. "And are ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is fulfilled." What does it mean there by the obedience being fulfilled? I don't think that's necessarily referring to our deaths, though that is in one way how our obedience is fulfilled. But the obedience there is our engagement in the warfare. Christians cannot take a sideline. They can't say, "I'm not going to be a fighter. I'm going to be, a hippie and, go to Woodstock and not care about this war we're engaged in." We are warriors. And our obedience must be fulfilled in this objective, taking down everything. All right, I'm going to say this. I don't care what your eschatology is. This is the command. You are bringing down all speculations. Even if you take a Rohan, that's not going to make sense to half the people in this room. But if you take a Rohan position where it is, you go out dying to do this and you ultimately lose, but you do it in a faithful manner, you're still doing it. All right. And that matters as much to the scripture. All right. To your faithfulness, that you are actually engaged in trying to destroy these things. Even if your belief is that we lose to that. All right. I'm not going to make a comment on that because I don't have time to make the comment on it. But my point is simply that this is good if your mindset is our objective is to destroy evil in this world. 1 Timothy, this is the last bit. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 through 7 say this, and I'm using this bit and hopping over to the end because Paul is going to say, "This command I entrust to you," and I want you to know what the command is so that it makes sense. Verses 3 through 7, this is the command. "As I exhorted you when going to Macedonia, remain on at Ephesus so that you may command certain ones not to teach a different doctrine, nor to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies, which give rise to mere speculation rather than furthering the stewardship from God, which is by faith. But the goal of our command is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and an unhypocritical faith. For some, straying from these things, have turned aside to fruitless discussion, wanting to be teachers of the law, even though they do not understand either what they are saying or the matters about which they make confident assertions." Notice the language there, as it is very similar to what happens at the end of the chapter here that I'm about to read. The turning of aside, what was that related to? Fruitless discussions. All right. And the command, what was the command? To teach good doctrine and oppose different doctrine. All right. Now we get this. "This command I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you may fight the good fight, keeping faith and a good conscience, which some, having rejected, suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith. Among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, so that they will be taught not to blaspheme." All right? We have real enemies and we have hindrances, and we got to fight against both of them. All right? It is not, sadly, this was the case that I found oftentimes there at the Southern Baptist Convention, is this consistent phrase kept being thrown out: Good Commission Baptist, or Great Commission Baptists. And then what's being smuggled in there is all sorts of wrong. They're saying, well, we just need to be unified around this one thing. We can be unified around that one thing, but we're making no progress if we've got idolatry in the midst, if we've got false doctrine in the midst. All right. The same thing I was hearing from them, and this is why I thought it was dangerous that they were saying it this year, was the exact same thing Rick Warren was saying last year in defense. Let's be Great Commission Baptists. This is a secondary issue, women pastors. You aren't going anywhere with women pastors. You can't be associated with that. You're not going to go anywhere. You're hindered. Just as you can't take AI so long as Achan and his family has stuff from the band. Here, Joshua's weeping. He goes to the Lord. Lord goes, why are you weeping? It's because Achan. You fool. Go deal with that.